There's a school in every town like it, old, creaky, with long hallways that seem to stretch forever. A place where the floors groan under your weight, the air smells faintly of mildew, and the lights flicker just enough to make you wonder if you really saw what you think you saw. For Maplewood High, that place was the West Wing. They called it the Whispering Hallway. Most schools have their ghost stories, right? A kid who never came back from the bathroom, a teacher who dropped dead in the middle of a lecture. But this was different. Everyone at Maplewood knew about the hallway. They didn't just whisper about it, they avoided it entirely. It started decades ago. The West Wing used to be bustling, math classes, locker rows, even the teacher's lounge. Then, one winter day in 1987, a janitor found Mary Tanner, a junior, slumped against her locker. Dead. No bruises, no blood. Just dead. They said her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling like she'd seen something no one else could. That's when the whispers began. At first, teachers chalked it up to nerves. Grief does funny things to people, they said. But students swore they heard it, soft murmurs just under their breath, and the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl, like someone's behind you, but when you turn around, there's no one there. A year after Mary's death, the school shut down the West Wing. Officially, it was for renovations. Unofficially, the principal couldn't keep teachers in their classrooms. They quit, one by one, refusing to even walk down the hallway. But that didn't stop the students. Every Halloween, some brave or stupid senior would dare to go into the West Wing after dark. They'd bring flashlights and Ouija boards, laughing nervously as they pushed open the heavy double doors. The thing is, no one ever made it past room 213. If you ask anyone who went in, they'll tell you the same thing. They heard the whispers. But it wasn't just the sound of voices. It was like the air itself was alive, pressing against their ears, filling their heads. Some swore they heard their own names, spoken softly like a lover's whisper. Others said it was Mary's voice begging for help. And then there's what happened to Chris Larkin. Chris was the class clown, always daring people to do stupid stuff. So, when he bet $50 he could stay in the West Wing for an entire night, no one doubted he'd try. He went in with a camcorder. This was back in 2005, when those were still a thing, and a flashlight. He never came out. The cops searched the hallway top to bottom. His parents begged the school to tear down the West Wing, but the district didn't want the bad press. Eventually, they boarded it up, and Chris became another Maplewood ghost story. But here's the thing. Last year, someone found Chris's camcorder. It was stuffed inside a locker in the West Wing, covered in dust. The battery was long dead, but when they plugged it in, it still worked. The footage? It starts with Chris grinning at the camera, making jokes about how scared everyone's going to be when he walks out alive. He pans the hallway with his flashlight, making ghost noises, acting like a total idiot. And then he stops. "What was that?" he whispers. The camera jerks, and you can hear it. The whispers. At first, it's faint, like wind through a crack in the window. But it gets louder, clearer. "Chris," a voice says. It's not a whisper anymore, it's a scream. The footage ends there. The school never explained how the camera got into the locker. Some say Chris's ghost put it there, desperate for someone to see what he saw. Others think it's just another prank, a way to keep the story alive. But if you ever find yourself near Maplewood High, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the West Wing, because once you hear the whispers, they never leave you. They follow you. There's a school in every town that has its secrets, its shadows lurking just beneath the surface. In Thornfield High, that shadow hangs over room 103. And no, it's not just the rumors about it being haunted. That's not what makes it different. What makes it special is that no one remembers it. Oh, sure, every student knows room 103. You pass it every day in the hallway. You can see the door, a little dented, faded paint, the number 103 in peeling gold. It's locked up tight, just like it always has been. No one ever goes in there anymore. But the weird part? No one remembers ever having a class there. You see, room 103 wasn't always like that. Back when the school was first built, it was just another classroom just like the rest. Kids sat in desks, took notes, laughed in between classes. But then something happened. Something no one talks about. In 1982, a teacher named Mrs. Harper was assigned to room 103. She was strict, no nonsense, the kind of teacher who didn't tolerate daydreaming or backtalk. But she was also different. She wasn't like the other teachers. There was something about her that made students feel like she could see straight through them. Eyes that never blinked, always fixed on you, as though she could read your every thought. It was supposed to be just another history class, except the students who had her, they started changing. First, it was small things. A student's handwriting becoming more elaborate. A shy kid who could barely look anyone in the eye, suddenly talking like he was an adult. A classmate who always showed up on time, but one day he just didn't. No one ever saw him again. By the end of the semester, things took a darker turn. Kids who went into room 103 started acting strange. They'd come out of the class with wild, bloodshot eyes, looking as if they'd seen something no one else could. And they'd never talk about what happened in there. The few that tried, they couldn't remember a thing. Then, one by one, the students who were in her class started disappearing. First it was quiet, then it became a pattern. The last one to vanish was a kid named Danny Keller. Danny had been one of the brightest students, always ahead of the curve. The night he disappeared, he was last seen leaving the school, a strange, blank look on his face. His parents got a call from the police 2 days later. Danny's body was found miles away, on a stretch of highway no one could explain. No injuries, no sign of struggle, just gone. After Danny, the school closed room 103. The door was locked, the windows boarded up. Mrs. Harper was gone too. No explanation, no goodbye. Some said she moved away, some said she left the world entirely. But the strange thing, people forgot about her. Teachers who'd been around for years, those who had worked with Mrs. Harper, all forgot her name, her face, as though their memories had been wiped clean. Even the kids who'd been in her class, they couldn't remember the lessons she taught, the stories she told, or even what she looked like. All that remained was a sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The thing about memories, though, they have a way of coming back when you least expect it. That's exactly what happened to Ryan Wells, a senior at Thornfield. One late afternoon, a couple of his friends dared him to go into room 103. They were convinced it was just a room full of old junk, nothing to be afraid of. But Ryan? He'd always felt a pull, a curiosity about the place. It was like a door in the back of his mind had been left slightly ajar, and something inside him was desperate to know what was behind it. So he went. The door was locked, of course, but Ryan had the perfect tool, a crowbar. The metal screeched as it twisted, and the door finally gave way. Inside, it was exactly as you'd expect. Dusty desks, broken chairs, an old projector in the corner. It looked like no one had touched it in years. But there was one thing that wasn't supposed to be there. At the far end of the room, on the blackboard, was a name, written in chalk, neat and precise. Ryan stepped forward, his heart racing. He could barely make out the name at first, the chalk smeared by time. But when he squinted, he saw it clearly. Mrs. Harper. The moment he read the name, something inside him clicked. Suddenly, memories flooded back, memories that had been locked away for years. He remembered being in that class as a kid, the way Mrs. Harper would stare at him like she was seeing into his soul. He remembered the other students, how they had changed after her lessons. He remembered the day Danny Keller disappeared, how everyone had just forgotten. But then, the door slammed shut behind him. Ryan spun around, his breath-quickening heart pounding. He tried to open the door, but it was locked again. He looked back toward the blackboard, and that's when he saw something else. Another name, written beneath Mrs. Harper's. It was Danny Keller's name, and beside it, a date. The date Ryan had found out Danny had been killed. But it was more than just a name on a chalkboard. It was a warning. Ryan's body was found a few days later. No signs of trauma, no signs of anything, except for the same blank stare that had come over every other student who had set foot in room 103. And so, the cycle continues. Kids disappear, memories get wiped, and the hallway outside room 103 grows quieter with each passing year. So if you're ever walking through Thornfield High and you happen to pass by that locked door, take a moment to listen closely. You might just hear something, soft, like a whisper, telling you to stay away. Something that sounds a lot like Mrs. Harper. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens if you remember her name. It was a late October afternoon when Jason Walker first heard the rumors about the school's oldest hallway. He was a sophomore at Glenwood High, a place that wasn't old enough to be haunted, but that didn't stop the stories. It was the kind of school where the hallways had that musty old book smell, where the floors creaked with every step, and where you could sometimes hear whispers late at night even though you were the only one there. But it was the south wing that had the weirdest reputation. The old part of the school, where the gym used to be before they added the new one and turned the old space into classrooms. There were stories, of course. All schools have them. Kids would talk about shadows moving in the corners of the hall, about the cold air that always seemed to cling to that part of the building. But it wasn't until Jason got stuck there one evening, doing extra credit in the library, that he started to get curious. It was a Friday, and he was finishing up a history assignment. The school was nearly empty, save for a few teachers tidying up their classrooms. Jason had a tendency to lose track of time. He'd been in the library for what felt like hours, and when he finally glanced at the clock, he realized he'd missed the last bus home. He decided to walk, but that meant cutting through the south wing to get to the parking lot. The hallways were eerily quiet. Too quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an uneven glow on the rows of lockers. Jason's footsteps echoed off the walls as he made his way down the hall. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, and he noticed a strange chill in the air, one that made his skin prickle. He chalked it up to the usual weird drafts the building had, but something was off this time. As he walked past the old gym doors, he thought he heard a faint sound, a shuffle. It wasn't much, just a soft scraping noise like something dragging across the floor. Jason froze. There was no one else in the building. The hall was empty. Curious, and admittedly a little nervous, Jason slowly stepped toward the sound. He reached the door to the old gym and put his hand on the handle. It was locked. He pushed harder, though, out of habit, and the door creaked open slightly. He pushed it farther, the scraping sound growing louder. Then, suddenly, the door slammed open, and Jason stumbled back, heart racing. He turned to look down the hallway where the lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move by themselves. He wasn't alone. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood. It was a tall man, with a face Jason couldn't quite make out, standing still, staring at him. There was no mistaking the feeling of being watched. It was the kind of gaze that made you feel like your very soul was being observed, analyzed. Jason's stomach twisted in a way he couldn't explain. He took a step backward. The figure didn't move. It just waited. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice wavering a little. No response. The figure stood motionless like a statue. Then Jason saw it. Just a flicker at first, but it was enough. The figure's eyes, they weren't right. They were empty. No pupils, no white. Just dark, hollow sockets that seemed to pull him in, sucking the warmth out of the air around him. Jason's heart skipped a beat, and in an instant every hair on his body stood up. He turned, running toward the exit, not daring to look back. The sound of his shoes slapping against the tile echoed through the building, and behind him he thought he heard a soft, eerie chuckle, like someone was enjoying his fear. He didn't stop until he reached the front doors. He pushed them open and ran out into the cold, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty, and as he threw himself into his car, he glanced back at the school. For a split second, he thought he saw movement in the window of the south wing, but it was gone before he could really process it. The next Monday, Jason tried to tell his friends about what happened. They laughed it off, as kids do. They told him it was probably just his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, no one had been in the south wing for years. But Jason wasn't so sure. Something about that hallway, that figure, felt real in a way that couldn't just be explained away. The next day, Jason decided to go back. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was the need for answers. But when he walked into the south wing again, everything was different. It was just as empty as before, but now there was a sign on the door to the old gym. It was handwritten in a messy scrawl. "This hall is forgotten, and so are you." Jason's stomach churned. He turned to leave, but then, from the far end of the hallway, he heard it again, the faint shuffle, a dragging sound. And this time he wasn't alone. The truth about the south wing of Glenwood High is this: some hallways aren't meant to be walked. Some schools don't forget their dark pasts, no matter how hard they try. And if you find yourself walking down that hallway late at night, listen closely, because the shadows don't forget, and neither do the people who once walked these halls.